Good morning, everybody. I'm Sinead Kelleher, and I'm the Senior Economist here at the Housing Agency. Welcome to today's session, which is on the topic of addressing vacancy and the efficient use of existing housing stock. This is our fifth and final session of this year's Housing Agency Conference, which we hope you found illuminating and useful to date. Today's session is especially interesting and is increasingly part of our public discourse around housing. Vacancy is a significant issue in many towns around the country, and maximising the use of our existing housing stock, especially in our towns and cities, is a critical element of a sustainable housing policy.
Sinead, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but may you just move your mic a little bit further from your mouth? It's just catching a bit of background sound. Thank you so much.
Gemma. In the Housing Agency, we're really gratified to see government policy focusing in on the area of vacancy, with Pillar 4 of Housing for All, including a range of plans and initiatives, including a new targeted approach to vacant stock, the new Croí Cónaithe Fund to provide services sites for new homes and to support refurbishment of vacant homes in regional towns and villages, the implementation of new regulations requiring short-term and holiday lets to register by default to Ireland, and the use of CPOs to target up to 2,500 vacant properties for onward sale. Beyond Housing for All, we're also looking forward to the publication of Town Centre First, which will bring even more to the table and help even more in driving regeneration. We have a diverse and interesting set of speakers today. Phil Prentice will speak first. Phil is the Chief Officer of Scotland's Town Partnership and will be speaking on town centre living. He'll be followed by Mick Mulhern, who is the Director of Planning in South Dublin County Council, and will talk about the City Edge project. This is a huge regeneration project, creating a new urban space in West Dublin. Our final speaker today is Ali Harvey, who's the Planning and Regeneration Programmes Manager with the Heritage Council. Ali has worked with a large number of towns and will be speaking on the collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme. After they speak, each of our speakers will join me for a Q&A session, and I'll strongly encourage you to send any comments or questions through to our panellists. I'd ask you to do so using the Q&A function on your screen, and to please indicate who you would like your question or query addressed to. If you do have a technical issue while watching the webinar, please try leaving and then rejoining. If that doesn't work, please send us a private message via the chat function, and one of our team will be able to respond to you directly. Please note that the chat function is only really for technical queries, and questions to our panelists should come through the Q&A function. And just so you know, a recording of today's session and all the sessions from the week will be available on the Housing Agency's YouTube channel. So our first speaker today will be Phil Prentice. Phil is the Chief Officer of Scotland's Town Partnership and Programme Director of Scotland's Improvement Districts. Phil considers it core to his role to ensure a collaborative community is built to support and promote the development of Scotland's towns. A graduate of the Universities of Ulster, West of Scotland and Glasgow, Phil is now focused on helping city districts, towns and smaller settlements across the country. So Phil's going to speak for about 15 minutes. And again, I'd encourage you to ask any questions through our Q&A function. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinead, for the introduction, and good morning, everybody. Ireland and Scotland are both nations of towns. Outside of Dublin, Cork, Glasgow, Edinburgh, the rest of it basically is towns. And for too long, towns have been lost in the sort of dominant narrative about smart cities and cities of the future. COVID and climate has changed everything. The way we live, the way we work, the way we get educated. This is a massive opportunities for towns to see a renaissance. So in terms of Scotland, as Celtic cousins, we thought we would share some of the learning that we have already gone through. The Scottish government seen towns as a massive priority back in 2010, post the last financial crash. And that's what STP as a national go-to aid, as we basically are a trusted central body for all thing towns across Scotland. We offer funding, resources, encourage collaboration, networks, etc. Data, evidence, all the toolkits required to make your town centres better places. We also deliver in Scotland's improvement districts. We've taken the business improvement district model and expanded that, and we've used a lot of innovation. So not only do we have town and city centre bids, but we also have tourism bids, cultural bids, community bids, digital bids, basically driving that collaboration of mainly private sector, but more recently social sector engagement to take control of their own place, of their own futures, and to co-invest to make these places better. A really additional revenue stream as well for local and central government. The third thing we do is policy. We have an existing town centre action plan, which was published in 2013. We have just gone through a review of that to take COVID and climate and the changing demographic into account, and that will be published early into 2022, which will give us a clear steer on how we actually reinvent and hold on to the renaissance that we're seeing in our towns just now. And part of that is the final thing we do, which is a drive to localism. If people are spending more time in their homes, in their hometowns, commuting less, etc., into the cities, how do we actually embed those good behaviours around food security, local supply chain, resilience, people just living more sustainable and localised lifestyles? So the Love Local campaign goes somewhere to address that. That's a snapshot of how we got to this point. We carried out an independent collaborative review, which was the Community and Enterprise in Scotland's Towns. That was led by architect Malcolm Fraser. The government's response came quickly on the back of that, and that's literally when STP, Scotland's Towns Partnership, was established. Part of our early journey was to raise awareness of our towns. You know, rural Scotland, city Scotland, they already had a voice in the Scottish Parliament. The town's voice was missing, so we set up a number of structures, cross-party group on towns and town centres. We went to the media and we started showcasing the beauty that lie within our towns. The fact that 66% of our population resided in towns, 2/3 of our businesses were located in towns, and we weren't investing or nurturing our towns the way we should have done. We had hollowed them out and we had made edge of town planning decisions. We had allowed sprawl development, and now was the time to actually refocus and start building out from the core again and looking at a multifaceted approach that beyond retail was going to be diminishing. So what other uses, evening economy, leisure, food and beverage, culture, public services? So we developed the Town Centre First principle as well, which both yourselves and the Welsh Government have embedded into their own policies moving forward. Town Centre First is a fantastic way of bringing all the disparate groups together, whether it's public sector, whether it's health, education, housing, economic development, tourism, the resident business population, the resident population themselves, brings everybody together and starts to look and take a much more place-based approach. Because without the collaborative approach, it's very difficult for things to happen in silos. And the Town Centre First principle drives investment back into the heart of our town centres. But it was also about recognising just how wonderful our towns are. And being an Irishman myself, you know, when I do go back over to the likes of Armagh, Enniskillen in the north and across to Monaghan in the south, our towns are absolutely fantastic. They're a storybook of our journey as a nation. They hold all of our identity, our culture, our heritage. We just need to reinvest and reimagine them to make them fit for the 21st century. In terms of specifically looking at vacancy, dereliction, empty homes, etc., what we needed to do was to come out with a town centre housing fund, which inspired quite a few innovative approaches around repurposing existing stock, encouraging the use of vacant and brownfield sites within town centres and weaving them into the broader strategies. So we've seen Kilmarnock build 200 new homes within the heart of the town centre, which encouraged a new college to be developed, an upgrade to the railway station. The council's headquarters was relocated in the town centre, and all of a sudden, a town that was seeing a lot of fragility just got a whole new energy, because with those people living in the town, you reduced the antisocial behaviour, you had passive surveillance, you had the town lit up at night, you had economic consumption, you had community. So actually repopulating our town centres is an absolute no-brainer. It's making use of existing built form. It's making use of the existing infrastructure. So the whole idea of reusing existing is a key priority of Scottish Government. reducing the new build sprawl and looking to our existing built form to make the most out of that and to reshape and to repurpose. So that is the approach that we have adopted, and it has been working pretty well. Another example here of Paisley, where they repurposed the council headquarters, they shrunk their footprint, and they brought in hundreds of new units for people to live in the town centre. And again, that has just, it's breathing life into that town again, where people are in the town centre. We've seen restaurants open, we've seen a cinema open, based on the fact that there's a few thousand people living in the town centre that weren't there a couple of years ago. So the repopulation thing now, in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods, more densely populated areas because of COVID, etc., and net zero, we really have to embrace this agenda, and it can be done, and this is proof that it can be done. It has to be on an evidential basis. So in Scotland, we developed a data model. So we modelled every single town in Scotland with a population over 1,000 people. There are 484 towns, and we have roughly 50,000 pieces of data behind each town. So it removes the anecdote and the emotion. It looks towards exploring how towns are within typologies, and they can explore within the typology. Rather than comparing apples and oranges, you're actually within a typology set that says we're quite similar in form and function. What are the different characteristics? Why is this town actually doing slightly better in our town? What can we learn from them? So it's a very good starting point in terms of developing an evidential approach. That drives into a more detailed audit, and then more innovative approaches. Are we just looking at town centre housing, or can we create a broader concept, creating a caring place where we have downsizing opportunities for our ageing demographic? We have affordable opportunities for the social care sector for people who can actually look after the ageing demographic. How do we actually get our local housing strategies linked to housing needs and demand, and linking that more broadly into concepts like a learning place, a caring place, etc. And again, we're seeing lots of collaboration with Public Health Scotland, the National Health Service, our education providers, our housing providers, our local authorities, in joining the dots, joining the agenda up together and working more collaboratively. Changing housing products in a changing market. In Scotland, we are getting older faster than the rest of Western Europe. We already have population. So we need to start coming up with housing concepts and products that are actually beneficial and reduce the burden on the healthcare system, and then the opportunities that flow from that around the care sector, the health and beauty sector, the leisure sector. It's our parents' generation, and we owe it to them. Specifically around vacancy and dereliction, I think that the difference between Scotland and Ireland is that we have a number of key agencies, very small but specialised agencies. So Scotland's Towns Partnership basically pull the collaborative together. Homes for Scotland, the private sector, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the Association of Local Council House Building, Scottish Government Housing Directorate. We act as that collaborative to pull these people together. And that is really the benefit of having something like STP, an independent body who can actually inspire public, private, third sector, co-housing, bringing all these ideas together, new housing products, and also the commercial sector, where does the money, institutions, the pension funds, etc. We also have the Land Commission, again, a very small, focused, targeted group. So they're looking specifically on dereliction. Scotland obviously was a very industrialised country. Now those industries have moved on. So with those huge brownfield sites, because there's a direct correlation between people's well-being and their proximity to vacant and derelict land. So there's now a £50 million vacant and derelict land fund. The purpose behind that is to actually start leveraging housing, affordable housing, private housing, mixed tenure developments, etc., taking the abnormals out of the ground, reducing the viability gap, using that money to actually reimagine well-designed housing in our towns and cities in particular. So you see the land for housing approach, that's looking at a change in the taxation system, trying to remove the concentrated ownership of big estates across Scotland and actually encourage those estate owners to divest and to get that land back into housing supply. I sit as one of my roles is also as a director of the Empty Homes Partnership as part of the wider Shelter Partnership. And we have done phenomenal work basically by targeting existing empty homes, the existing empty stock, I'll move on to the next slide. The graphic on the right, 47,000 long-term empty private sector homes, and we have 30,000 people who are homeless. So we have now managed to bring back somewhere in the region of 6,500 of those homes back into productive use. The cost of doing that ranges between 6,000 and 25,000, but compare that with a new build, and it just shows you the value that you can drive. We now have an empty homes officer in 25 of 32 local authorities, and that empty homes officer has a range of tools, advice, funding, carrot and stick type approach. Encourage people who've maybe accidentally inherited a home and they don't really want it, they don't know what to do with it, or they don't have the wherewithal to actually productive use. So having that expertise across the country has driven so much more success. And again, we're just talking about a tiny central body in the Empty Homes Partnership with probably 4 members of staff who've coordinated that Scottish Government investment to allow local authorities to benefit from that level of expertise on the ground. So town centre living, a combination of demonstration to show that it's possible, but also to show that there's still a marked failure. It's very difficult to encourage people back into the town centre. You know, you're living above a shop potentially. Maybe there's not a huge population within the town centre. So you need to take a collaborative place-based approach to show that there's a bigger vision for this place, to show that it's looked after and there will be more people coming. So we did see that there was a market failure. Market failure predominantly because the private sector still goes after the farmer's field and wants the green belt and wants the zero rated new build. That has to stop because of climate. So we need to start thinking about how we use our taxation system and our VAT, etc., much more constructively to actually focus back in on the town centres. We have punitive council tax for people who leave their home deliberately empty, so we can charge them double council tax as a financial disincentive. But I think if we get to that stage, you've probably lost the battle already. It's about encouraging and making it easier for them to ensure that empty homes are brought back into use before they literally become empty homes. Scottish Government and UK Government have both recognised that post-COVID and with the climate emergency, town and city centres are incredibly important in terms of being critical infrastructure towards economic recovery, our social cohesion, and also environmental sustainability. We've seen that with the £325 million place-based investment fund. 140 million of that has already been allocated to local authorities across Scotland for town centre regeneration. I mentioned the £50 million to cover the vacant and derelict land. Again, that is primarily used to de-risk housing sites. And we have just published Housing to 2040, which is a 3.5 billion fund for a new target of 110,000 affordable homes. It was 100,000, but with the Greens going into a coalition with the SNP, they've asked for a further 10,000. The current system, to be blunt, deliver that within that budget. The current system is still predicated on massive amount of new build and green belt. To be honest, very quickly, our housing colleagues are going to have to get into a different place to start looking at retrofit and refurb. COVID, for example, has led a lot of large corporates to disinvest in their commercial stock. The city centres are really feeling it because office workers are not coming back en masse. Even the education system has changed. Take Edinburgh, for example. Edinburgh on a normal day would have 80,000 tourists. Sorry, it would have 80, it would have 40,000 office workers and it would have 500,000 tourists. To be honest, Edinburgh's quite dystopian. The city centre just now, none of those people are there. The workers are all still working from home, probably in places like Linlithgow or on the fringe of the city. The tourists are not coming back apart from Indigenous tourists. We don't have any overseas tourism. And the students are working a blended pattern. So they're only spending some of the time in the city and then some of the time at home. That's a massive opportunity. Undoubtedly, it's a challenge for the city, but COVID is now driving a retrofit, a refurb, a reinvention of office spaces within town centres for housing. We don't want to follow the English version of permitted development rights, which leads to low quality housing. We're taking a much more high quality approach. And MPF4 was led in front of the Parliament yesterday, and it clearly states that we will have no more out of town retail sprawl, no more out of town development. We need to fill in our town and city centres and repopulate them much more densely with climate in mind and also with COVID in mind. We need to reimagine, and that in itself makes the most of our existing built form, takes all the empties out, fills it full of people and activity. And that to me is the massive opportunity. We also mentioned a changing demographic. We have Generation X, Y, Z who do not want long-term mortgages. They want different types of housing products. We've got the fastest growing aging demographic, and we build very little for our parents' generation. So we are now in dialogue and looking at pilots and tests to see what type of housing products we could actually deliver that meets the needs of our changing demographic. So we can talk and talk and talk. The truth be told, we don't have an option. If we don't deliver on this, the whole planet is going down the stank. So I think we need to use this opportunity to think about repopulation of our towns, making more use of our vacant and derelict sites within our town and city centres, making sure that housing becomes a human right for everybody, and we build a high quality that's net zero and community focused. So that's just some of the learning that I thought I would share from Scotland, and I'll be happy, I suppose, in the panel session to take further questions. Thanks for your time.
Phil, thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting session and a great way of opening up this morning's session. I think there was a few issues that you brought up here that kind of particularly struck me. I think reference to sustainability and the importance of considering the environment in terms of regeneration and vacancy and so on is core. And it's something I didn't mention at the opening, which is that underpinning the 4 pathways in housing for all is the importance of enabling a sustainable housing system. So it was very good to get your perspective on that, as well as how kind of that is integrated with and is also impacted by COVID at the moment, and perhaps the changing way of living and, you know, the kind of possible changes in retail and retail patterns. As an economist and a data nerd, I was also particularly interested in the evidential basis that's being used to kind of create this typology of different towns in order to measure the success of the various schemes, which I think is very interesting. And, you know, kind of in a world of finite resources, it's, you know, very valuable to be able to kind of track how successful different schemes and different programs have been. So perhaps that's something you could maybe expand on later. So thank you very much for that. I think that was a very strong way of starting off, and to get the perspective of what's happening in Scotland and to maybe kind of take some of those learnings and see how they apply to Ireland. We're going to move on to our second speaker now, who's Mick Mulhern. Mick is a qualified town planner and urban designer with nearly 20 years experience. Mick spent a lot of time working around London, but returned to Ireland in 2019 to take on the role of Director of Planning and Transport in South Dublin County Council. He's now working on the council's corporate management team and is responsible for leading the council's plans to develop a significant amount of growth across the county's strategic development zones and regeneration lands at Adamstown, Clonburris, Tallaght, Fortunestown, and the City Edge lands. Mick is also responsible for ensuring the county develops a sustainable transport network, including leading delivery of the council's ambitious Cycle South Dublin programme and placemaking improvements to the county's network of towns, villages and centres. So it sounds like quite a diverse and interesting job. So looking forward to hearing from you. So that's Mick. And again, I'd ask you, any questions you've got, please put them into our Q&A function. Thank you.
Sorry, just had a bit of difficulty there, unmuting for a minute. So just give me 1 second. I'm just, there we go. So hopefully that's up on the screen now. So that was really interesting, Phil, just to say at the outset. And I think a number of the points you made there are very relevant for Ireland, as you say. Okay, so I going to talk a little bit almost at a slightly higher level in terms of but more focused on kind of underused land, and it still kind of chimes with a lot of what Phil was talking about in relation to bringing people back into our cities, focusing on principles around compact growth, moving away from sprawl and out-of-town retail and consolidating more people living within, you know, closer proximity to the city centre, and the benefits that that can bring in terms of, you know, kind of making uses and development more viable. So I'm going to focus on our current earliest stage project, if you like, which we call the City Edge. And it's a collaboration between South Dublin County Council and Dublin City Council. So what is this project all about? So you can see on the map that the lands are about 700 hectares in size, and they sit about 2 or 3 kilometres from Dublin city centre. In size-wise, it's almost the same size as Dublin city itself between the two canals. So it's a huge part of the city, and that in itself is, you know, it's large-scale, long-term city making, and we're right at the very, very beginning of that process right now. Today, the area is an incredibly important and vibrant piece of the city. There's about 1,500 businesses there, about 1,600 homes there, 5,000 people live there. There's about 25,000 people go to work there every day. And the area gives about 4% of Dublin's employment base and generates about 2 billion of GVA to the Irish economy every year. So it's an incredibly vibrant and important part of the city. And as we're thinking about how that place might evolve over the next 30, 40, 50 years, it's recognizing that the employment offer that's there is incredibly important. Yes, a lot of the land is very close to the city centre, and subsequently it might well be underutilized, and there's an opportunity to intensify that more. But ultimately, we need to ensure that there's an employment base retained there as we look to bring in more intensified uses into it. So as part of this process, we, working with Dublin City Council, we've appointed a master plan team, and we've set ourselves some kind of ambitious objectives for the project. You know, creating livable cities, a lot of what Phil talked about there, about creating a network of new neighbourhoods and small scale kind of high streets and villages within this place. Facilitating housing at a significant scale, potential for, you know, 75 to 85,000 people living here within the next 30 to 40 years. In Ireland, we have the National Planning Framework, which has determined that, you know, we need to house 1 million people over the next 19 years, of which 300,000 need to be in Dublin, and of which half of that need to be, a minimum half of that need to be on brownfield land, like this type of land around City Edge. So that's hugely challenging to do. We want the development to be transport oriented. We want to fast track towards zero carbon by 2050. And as I've said already, the existing employment is really important, but there's an opportunity to attract additional employment into the space as well. Character, urban design, a 50% green cover, and a plan that's credible, fundable, and deliverable ultimately. So as part of this work, what we've done is we've looked at how this area might, 3 different scenarios for how this area might develop. The first was a significant, what if this place became a significant new commercial centre for Ireland, operating at an international scale as a focus for FDI, etc. Second option was, what if it was an evolution of the existing urban industry that's there at the moment, thinking about advanced manufacturing? Or if the third one, what if it was about residential-led development? So we assessed those 3 options against our objectives. The third came out as the preferred, but what we found was that there was elements of 1 and 2 that we really liked and actually felt would create a really quite more of an interesting mixed place. So we set ourselves a brief at that point, and we're currently working on developing this. So actually what we did do is we set ourselves a strategic brief, which was to have a major centre with employment space, to promote urban industry, to have a residential-led development with, you know, for 75 to 85,000 people, be a place where we could attract anchors into it, recognise the importance that this will take a significant amount of time, and that, you know, what happens over the next 5 to 10 years, there might be meanwhile stuff, but actually those early pieces of delivery are really important. And obviously the importance around social amenity and infrastructure that's needed and required to be delivered over time. At that point, once we set that brief, we actually went out and did a public consultation, sharing that information on our scenarios and our preferred brief, and sought feedback. We ran a series of events and during September and October, and we had about 8,000 people join that conversation. through internet. We had a series of conference events and workshops. So 8 people participated during that and gave, you know, feedback and views, etc. So we're currently going through that, and by participation, not everybody formally gave comments, but they attended workshops and they came to conferences and they gave us submissions, etc., etc. Completed surveys and that sort of stuff. So a real diverse kind of mixed people kind of feeding into that. So at that point, so as part of what we consulted on at that point, and we're evolving this now as we go, but we were saying that within that place, what we need is a skeleton of big moves that will ultimately they'll become the guiding principles, and in time, as this place develops, you know, everything around that, the meat of the place will effectively flex and change over time. But we have a series of big moves that we think are critical to, one, creating a good place, and two, unlocking these lands so that development can take place within them. So I've just included a couple of them here. So, for example, one big move is about, you know, much better orbital public transport connections, so that the city edge lands feels fully connected into its surroundings of, you know, Temple Ogue or Walkinstown and Drimna, Inchicore, Ballyfermot, Clondalkin. So it's connected into those places with really good quality public transport, which in the first years may well be bus, but in the future, we're advocating we're encouraging NTA to ensure that the potential for these to be light rail in the future is retained. Another big move is a new heavy rail station. If you're on the train line coming out of Euston to Cork, the DART Plus public consultation just launched during the week on this. So that will see this train line, which currently has 2 or 3 trains stopping every hour, increasing that to 15 trains an hour. And we're advocating for a new rail station to be provided here, right just to the south of Ballyfermot. So if you can imagine living in Ballyfermot today, no access to that train line, but once DART Plus is delivered and then this train station follows that, then you could have a brand new station on your doorstep, 15 trains an hour, bringing you right into Houston and all the way into the city as well. It's a real game changer, not only for those existing residents and housing estates that are in Ballyfermot, but equally becomes a key kind of transport-oriented new centre for Dublin, you know, focused around a significant new public transport or public station. Equally, we're advocating for a new Lewis stop on the existing red line that comes out from Tala, or comes out from the city, and again with the idea that becomes the focal point for a new centre, with development kind of taking place around that. But it's not all about heavy or more costly infrastructure. Equally important is that very important active travel connections. So, you know, two significant ones here are, you know, connecting Timon Park all the way through the lands, all the way out to Phoenix Park as an active travel, and the type of development that can come alongside that. And second is the Grand Canal, the Royal Canal. So the opportunities to provide active travel and for development to sit alongside that, to celebrate that canal, and for it to become a kind of a cornerstone and a precedent for how we can see development. You know, if you look at places like King's Cross in London and how they've celebrated the canal and kind of use that as a real placemaking tool. You know, flagship parks, open space, flooding. There's a big flooding issue in the area at the moment. The Cammock runs through there. It's largely culverted, so you probably don't even know it's there. But it's a water feature that, as climate changes as well and flooding becomes more of an issue, we've done our modelling. We know this area will flood even more in the future. So how do we address that flooding issue and provide the public parks and the open spaces that we know we're going to need, so that when we build these new developments get built, there is actually some meaningful, good quality open space there for people to use. So how do we build the next new Herbert Park or Stephen's Green? How do we incorporate that in the right location so that it provides amenity for Dubliners and people who live and work there, but also kind of can be used to kind of manage some of those flooding issues as well. So incredibly complicated to figure out how we deliver them because of the existing land use arrangements, but that's work that we're doing at the moment. And obviously, and incredibly important is the utility network. It's under capacity at the moment. We need, you know, new utilities, new infrastructure to facilitate this development. And importantly, how will we power this place, and how do we do that in a way that's from sustainable energy sources? So, for example, one of the things that's being looked at the moment is the big 9B sewer that runs through this area. Dublin has 3 or 4 big sewer pipes. They're all under capacity at the moment. They all need to be upgraded. That is something that Irish Water are looking at. But how might we take power from the heat that is in that sewer network and use that to power an energy network in the area in the future? So when we take all of those kind of the strategic brief and those big spatial moves and we put them together, we get to a kind of a framework that we consulted on, which, you know, has a series of new high street village locations connecting into Walkinstown and into Core, into, you know, expanding these existing villages, supporting and enable them to become, you know, more sustainable, coupled with a large new centre between the new heavy rail station on the Euston to Cork train line and the existing train Lewis stop at Kylemore. So how do we create a new large centre for Dublin here? How do we retain industry along the M50 and kind of bringing that into the site? And equally, how do we ensure that we retain workspace, you know, as part of new mixed use development? So that where we are at the moment is where we've done our scenarios, we did our evidence, we've done our scenarios, we have a preferred scenario. We're working that up at the moment to fully understand what it means, so that the end of the year, early in the next year, our intention is that we're able to clearly articulate the size of the prize, if you like what's the vision for the place, what Ireland and Dublin could gain and benefit from this in terms of housing delivery, employment space, you know, livable new communities, compact growth, like what is the size of the prize? But with that, what's the ask, what's needed to facilitate that delivery, which is largely about, you know, big infrastructure and state investment and the alignment of state agencies to deliver what they need to do to make that happen. But equally, a message to the landowners and developers that this is what's needed to make this place happen, and ultimately everybody needs to kind of be pulling in the same direction. So that's where we want to get to very early next year, with clarity then about, okay, well, how do we move forward a number of these projects to start to turn an idea into a much more concrete plan with investment, and with that investment then comes the certainty from people who want to buy places to live there because they know it's going to happen. And I think, you know, that's the intention. So during 2022, it's about getting into more and more detail on that. So that's it from me. So at that point, I'll stop sharing and I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and is an extremely interesting project, and certainly one that I imagine there'll be some discussion about in our Q&A, and certainly one to keep watch on over the next number of years. A huge kind of a huge bit of work in terms of place management, place development. Moving on to our final speaker for a kind of a different perspective, we're going to talk to Ali Harvey. So Ali is Programs Manager and has a background in planning and economics, with 22 years experience in setting up and running collaborative regeneration programs in Ireland and in the UK. So Ali has set up the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme in 2016, which is actually included in the programme for government, and currently has over 70 partners and 15 member towns, with a significant waiting list to join the programme. Ali also coordinates the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme podcast series, which was launched back in November 2020. So Ali has a huge amount of experience in engaging with towns, and he's going to speak to us now. Again, as always, please put any questions into the Q&A function. Ali, take it away.
Okay, folks, can you see those slides all right? Yeah.
We're seeing them in the edit mode. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, folks, great to be here. So I'm just going to talk about the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme, what we do, you know, why we do it, and where we're at the minute. So just in terms of the presentation, 4 parts. I'm also going to look at funding pathways. Obviously, it's really important to look at how, you know, how can we get the investment in there into the towns. Also look at the benefits and the impact of the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme, which I'm now going to call the CTCHC because it's a bit of a mouthful for everybody. And then finally, just look at the 4 phases of the programme. Okay, so in terms of what we've been doing so far, we started this in 2016. Basically, people kept coming to me in the Heritage Council and asking me, could I help? And the first person to come to me was Tara Buckley from RG Data. So, I mean, it was very hard to ignore the call, you know, that people really needed help. So I basically, in that first year, I didn't have any funding. I went around the country asking people to sort of help me, the universities, the ITs, they were just so critical and immense to this program. So yeah, we have got 15 towns in the program at the minute. We have a project charter, but we also have a massive waiting list. So I just want to sort of talk about the whole sort of program community. We have 70 partners. We work with the government departments, we work with local authorities and also the business sector. In terms of what our operations are, we spend a lot of time setting up projects. So that's really what I do, project management, program management. So I do the macro and the micro. Also, we organise workshops, webinars. Obviously, this year we've been pivoting towards webinars. And then there's a methodology, a 15-step methodology, which all the towns use. And I created that, designed that at the very start. So they all use the same methodology. And just to say that the collaborative town centre health checks that we produce, the baselines are very relevant to the SEA and the EIA directives in terms of strategic environmental assessment. And we've been really lucky and fortunate to have got 2 national awards. So Most Enterprise in Town Award from Bank of Ireland for Tralee in 2017 and Letterkenny then the following year. So we won those back to back. So yeah, just in terms of the programme for government, I mean, we have been advocating for Town Centre First policy since 2019. So it's really, really important, you know, because the policy doesn't exist in the country at the minute. And if you look at the extract there in the bottom left, that was a workshop that we actually did with Phil. So we got Phil over to Dundalk in December 2019. And we had about 50 people in the room all talking about, you know, what are the issues for towns, for town centres, and also what kind of policy do we need. So the programme for government then, a few months later, it included obviously to prioritise the town centres first. And the CTCHC is very much at the heart of that. Okay, so in terms of the 5 pillars, these really, everything I do is visual because I just don't have the time to sort of write reports anymore. So this is really just to show you visually, you know, who we work with, the collaboration, the partnerships that we create, the relationships, the networks, everything that we do. In terms of colour coding, I was really quite surprised at the very start of the programme that I had to actually set this up. So we base our building land use classification on GOAD, and then we also add to it. So, I mean, obviously Irish land use is very unique. I suppose just to say as well, then the colour coding, the GIS colour coding, so all the towns use the same colour coding, and we can also look at vacancy. We try to look at, you know, we try to establish firstly, what is the vacancy rate in the town centre? So as I say, we had to create all this at the very, very start. The 15 towns in the programme, this is just a map to show where they are all located. So really what happened in the first workshop, I had 70 people came, and then for the second workshop, 130 people turned up. And as I say, I don't have any support staff. I'm waiting for the Town Centre First policy to, you know, invest in this programme. So it was really difficult. The numbers were just going bonkers, really bonkers. And yeah, I mean, it was great to have 130 people, but it's a lot to do if it's just one person. In terms of the waiting list, then this waiting list, you know, I've just been sort of, I suppose, compiling it this year. With lockdown, obviously a lot of towns are really keen to get going. What this shows to me is the energy on the ground. The grassroots really want to get going. They need to be harnessed. They need to be supported. The towns are all around the country in terms of the waiting list. Okay, the beauty of working at a programme on a macro level is that the programme is able to highlight what the gaps are, you know, so this is kind of our gap analysis, I suppose you would say. So really, you know, there's macro data gaps that cumulatively are actually stopping progress. And I would say for the Housing for All, particularly Pathway 4, that these data gaps need to be acknowledged and they need to be addressed. So, you know, there's not enough information on land use and floor space. There's very little information on building condition. Heritage and cultural significance. I mean, a lot of our designations for architectural conservation areas have been done for quite a few years, so we need to revisit those, and also ownership. Okay, so I mentioned the 15-step methodology at the very start. We have this 15-step process. So it's really, we take the towns through this process. It's a critical path, I suppose, but really just to say it is quite difficult because, as I tried to explain at the previous slide with the GIS colour coding, the lift that we've had to do has been enormous. So land use surveys, that's step 2, footfall, pedestrian surveys, step 3, business surveys, step 4, consumer surveys, step 5. Step 5 is actually a really difficult step to do. And we work with the third levels and the universities to try and work through all this. So yeah, just in terms of ownership maps, that's a very hard thing to get because the ownership information is out of date or it's not registered. It's really quite difficult when you start to drill into the towns to get the data because it just doesn't exist. So we're trying to create that, obviously. Excuse me. Okay, so in terms of our output, this is a nice land use map that we've produced for Sligo. We've actually just updated this. So we will be publishing the new land use for Sligo Town Centre in the next few weeks. So really just to highlight what this map actually tells us. So really what it's saying is that the retail ground floor vacancy rate in Sligo is 18.4%, and the norm in Europe would be around 5%. The range that you're looking for is 5 to 11%. So you're not really meant to be above 11%. And we have quite a few of our towns in the programme that are above 20% and are in the high 20s. Also, this land use map is showing that there's approximately 200 vacant buildings in Sligo Town Centre. We also have another town in the west where like streets actually are just completely empty. So, you know, the 18.4 is the ground floor, but obviously upper floors could be 80% vacancy levels. Also, in terms of Sligo, the consumers, it's really interesting to talk to them to find out what do they like, what do they not like about the town centre. One of the things that was really interesting about Sligo, this survey was done pre-COVID, and as I say, we're updating the surveys at the minute. So one of the key indicators showed that 63% of online shoppers in Sligo were actually shopping on shops that were not based in Sligo. So that was pre-COVID. So yeah, I mean, it's you know, some of the towns really do need support. Tipperary task force was set up. I got a phone call from Minister Damien English to ask would I help, and I said okay, well we could set up a CTCHC project and Tipperary town could come into the programme, so that's what we did. So yeah, Tipperary, this land use survey, this is February 2021. We've actually just resurveyed TIP, so we'll be publishing that next week. The retail vacancy rate for TIP is 31%, and as I say, the norm is around 5%. So just to say, it's a wee bit like, you know, full employment. You don't actually want full employment. You need a few units floating about and being exchanged. But I mean, 31% is definitely not what you want. Okay, in terms of pathways to funding, there's a lot of funds out there. There's the URDF, there's the RRDF, there's Housing for All, there's the Historic Towns Initiative from the Heritage Council. So, I mean, there's a lot of different funds and different organisations and different agencies. And I suppose really the Town Centre First policy that we were advocating for would pull all that together. So yeah, it's just really, really important that we need this Town Centre First policy. Okay, just to give you an example of Tralee and the journey and the pathway that they've been on. So we did Tralee was the first town over the line with the collaborative Town Centre Health Check model. And that was, we worked with IT Tralee, with their marketing department, we worked with Kerry County Council and obviously Tralee Chamber. Just a really lovely project, great team that are all still working together. So yeah, that was launched in August 2017. And then a few months later, Tralee won Most Enterprising Town Award. And I think the judge's citation, we were told, was that it was all to do with the collaboration and all the partnerships that have been created during the CTCHC process. So then Historic Towns Initiative, the Heritage Council, we recently gave them an award of 200,000 to look at trying to reuse vacant buildings. And then more recently, in the last few months, 15.93 million has been awarded under the URDF. And there is Norma Foley, who was actually the mayor of Tralee at the time when we did the launch. So yeah, she knows a lot about the CTCHC in Tralee. So yeah, what is actually needed? Town Centre First policy is just critical. We're waiting, I suppose, 18 months at this stage. We really need support for the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme as soon as possible. As I say, we have 45 towns on the waiting list. That energy needs to be, you know, tapped into. On the ground. We are a boots on the ground programme. That's what I keep sort of saying, that we are boots on the ground. Also in terms of action, we need action for CPO, but I also feel that CPO cannot unlock it, that we need to look at compulsory sale orders. And also, you know, Denmark already do this and Scotland are looking at it. You know, it's just so important. I used to, in the private sector, before I came to the Heritage Council, I worked in the private sector and I used to do CPO arbitration hearings, and it's very difficult for local authorities. So, you know, I think we need to look and be realistic about what are the blockages and, you know, trying to remove those blockages and support people. In terms of community improvement districts, again, the Dutch are, you know, they have those. Just to say and really highlight, you know, Phil was talking about business improvement districts. We only have 4 town centre bids, and that includes Dublin Town, which is obviously a city level. So we only have 4 bids in Ireland compared to over 40 in Scotland. That bid legislation was brought in 2006, and there was no project support office or national strategy brought in to support the development of that sector. So, I mean, 4 bids is not a great record. Do we need to now, you know, sort of pivot to community improvement districts? Again, we need to look at this. Community development trusts, town centre development trusts, we don't have anything there for the investment to sort of come in. There has to be a pathway. Conservation area regeneration schemes. Now, these are done in Scotland, and I'm actually looking at how do you do cars in Scotland and how could that be applied in Ireland. As I say, a lot of our architectural conservation areas are quite out of date, and it's trying to, you know, sort of support that designation, because to me, ACAs could be a lot more in this country. Also heritage action zones, other countries have those, we don't have those either. You know, how do we sort of focus on our town centres or historic cores if we don't have the designations and we don't have the sort of structures to do this? And then really just say that, you know, next year there's going to be a huge focus for us in the programme. We're going to be moving towards digital dashboards and also making sure that we're Aarhus compliant. And just to say as well that the CSO SDG unit has recently come on board with the programme as a sponsor. So that's going to be a very busy year for us next year. Okay, just to sort of summarise, nearly finished here. Just to summarise in terms of what we've been doing this year, as I say, with the projects ongoing, we had a webinar with the Irish Regions European Office in February looking at indicators, trying to look at indicators for strategic environmental assessment. We also had a webinar in May looking at compulsory sale orders in Europe and how do they do it and how do they do it in Scotland, as in what are they hoping to do. And what was really interesting was that nearly 400 people turned up to that webinar, and it's also up on YouTube. So yeah, that's been a really interesting exercise to sort of find out what other countries are doing. And trying to support, I suppose, local authorities who are maybe slightly bogged down with the CPO process. Then a few weeks ago, we had, with UCC, they set up a Young Planners Forum. So we had a webinar looking at digitalisation of data for town centres. Then about 3 weeks ago, we had a webinar for Meanwhile Use, and we published a research report by Jude Sherry and Dr. Frank O'Connor. So I can put up the link to that. And then actually coming up in the next 2 weeks, we have our Reeling in the Year event where the programme community will get together. Okay, so just to talk about the benefits, you know, it is a data-driven programme, and Phil talked about that, and it's just really, really important that you have that data, that you have that evidence, that you can sort of do your spatial planning properly. And it's also about value for money for the taxpayer, for the public purse, that the investment decisions are actually based on data. And we're looking to sort of obviously link with GeoHive. As I say, we're very much pivoting towards the UN SDGs. We're also looking to use these baselines for EU funding, because obviously the European Commission system likes to have ex-ante appraisals, which is something that we would have had in Northern Ireland when I was starting out for Peace and Reconciliation. So yeah, I mean, it's very much trying to make sure that the investors and the people that are in charge of the funds know what we're doing. So we're talking about social capital, creating social capital. We want to look towards social cost benefit analysis. We're trying to create regeneration engines, just to say that regeneration doesn't just happen. It has to be facilitated. And also what we're talking about is collaborative processes, participative democracy. So really what we're trying to do is look at regeneration of historic town centres as a focus for local communities. And it's about enhancing sense of place, civic pride and belonging, and making communities stronger. And this is really what gets me out of bed in the morning. You know, I have an absolute love for community empowerment. So in terms of the 4 key phases, this is my vision for the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme. As I say, I've been working with a lot of others. We have over 70 partners. The waiting list is just immense. So we're in phase 1 at the minute, and we're sort of there, and we're waiting for the Town Centre First policy. Phase 2 is moving forward in terms of town centre building renewal plans and action plans, and actually getting, you know, talking to the owners of the properties. We've started doing workshops with owners of vacant property. But really phase 2, you know, that's the sort of meat in the sandwich, and you know, we need to get moving. Which is why we need the Town Centre First policy, and I'm hoping to bring 3 towns into phase 2 in January, and then phase 3, these phases can all run concurrently. So it's really looking at what kind of models do we need. We need new finance models, we need new repurposing models, and also funding models. So we're trying to sort of, you know, do the macro and the micro at the same time. And then obviously phase 4 is all about maintenance. You know, these buildings, as we know, the alarm bells didn't go off at 11%, so a lot of these buildings are in a really bad state. And we need to, you know, look to see about, you know, traditional skills, getting people employed, trained up as quickly as we can. So yeah, really just to say the Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme has been, you know, just an immense journey for me and the others involved. And just to say thanks very much to all those universities and ITs who came with us in the first year when we didn't have any funding. And now we do, and we're in the programme for government. So onwards and upwards, hopefully. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Ali. Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting presentation, very interesting perspective, and a huge amount of work going on, obviously. So I'm now going to invite our 3 speakers back, hopefully, and then we're going to have a Q&A session for the next 20 minutes or so. So if anybody does have questions, we have our Q&A box, which is open there. I see questions coming in. But I'm going to start off with a question for all 3 of our panelists, please, which is, I've noticed that all 3 of you have referenced the importance of collaboration and stakeholder engagement. And I was kind of hoping you could elaborate on that and speak to me about how you kind of facilitate that and who your key stakeholders are and how best a collaboration is working. So Ali, maybe collaboration is in the name of what you do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's our USP, really, you know, and that C at the start is very, very important. That's really how we function. And as I say, you know, with the 5 pillars, those pillars, obviously, we're just trying to make them, you know, we're trying to widen and deepen those as we go along. And with the CSO coming on board, you know, that's obviously very important. But we also want to sort of do citizen science. And, you know, Phil was sort of talking about communities. I mean, this is a community-based program. And it is trying to do the macro and the micro. So it is a massive collaboration. And I really just feel that, you know, the time for collaboration in Ireland is now. And, you know, it's definitely something that I have been doing, you know, I mean, going back to my postgrad days, you know, I would have been looking at community empowerment. So, I mean, it's a very worthwhile way to do it. It's the best way to do it because you get trust in the system. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. And it's really interesting for me because developers have started phoning me. And I mean, I would know from the theory that once the private sector starts to get involved, that's a really good sign because then they know that you're trying to reduce the risk.
Very good. Phil, I know you mentioned as well the importance of engagement in a community. Is there anything you want to add about kind of collaboration and stakeholder engagement and getting people on board with what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's important that the problems viewed holistically and the solutions delivered collaboratively. You know, we now have what's called the place principle, which is a sort of advancement of the town centre first principle. And that was recognition that traditionally economic development, housing, regeneration, those sort of silos on their own didn't have the heft to actually fix the problem. It needed the community. It needed the people on the ground at the granular level. It needed that level of evidential data, you know, to say what is the real problem with this place and how do we actually prevent it? Never mind just try to retrofit and fix it belatedly, but how do we actually go in with early interventions and preventions to make the whole thing work a lot? So you weave in the culture, you weave in the heritage, you weave in the people on the ground, and you start telling the stories and you get people to really embrace their culture, their heritage, they become a community. You can't just impose change on people, and commercially led models that we've had for the last 50 years have done nothing but harm. They've actually hollowed out our town centres, so nobody wants to live in them anymore. They all want to live in a field in the middle of nowhere and they need to drive 50 miles to their work. And then to come home at night to pull their curtains, they don't know who their neighbours are. What sort of a life is that? So we are actually forcing people back in together and building that sort of story and glue of society, because we have to with COVID and climate. There's no option. We just have to do it. We have to find new ways of delivering this. And the only way we can deliver it is in true partnership. As Ollie's done a fantastic job, almost for the last few years, driving this agenda in Ireland, which is great because you've got a starting point now. But in Scotland, we've recognised this, that we need to listen to the voices that are less heard. We need to give those communities a voice in what's happening. Otherwise, they will walk away from it. They won't engage with it and it won't work. So that time and effort of bringing those voices together, and I would include all the sectors. It's the community sector, the academic sector, it's the commercial sector, it's the public sector. We just need everybody in the room because we don't measure things the way we used to. What's the point in measuring vacancies or rental values? We need to measure health and well-being. We need to measure the green zero. We need to look at different metrics. And the only way we can do that is bringing in the agencies and working more with a common goal. So it's vital. It's the only way forward is that collaborative approach.
Thanks, Phil. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I thought that was well put. I think the collaboration is good. I think to identify the issues and try and solve them, no one person or team can do that. I think Ali's point about reducing the risk is really, really valid, because I think in a project like what I'm working on at City Edge, it's a slightly different scale. So reducing this, we will never get to a position where lots of people, like there'll be a whole cohorts of people that won't like City Edge or what's happening there just by the virtue of compact growth, higher density. That would just jar with a lot of people. But some people will really like it. So I think we've got to recognize that we're never going to win everybody over. But actually, I think as Ali, I think it's de-risking it to the point where we're identifying the issues, trying to be collaborative, recognizing that you can't get everybody on board and you won't, but understanding that those concerns from the outset and figuring out ways to respond to that and not shut it out, I think is important. But we will not get everybody on board with what we're trying to do. And that's okay so long as you know it at the outset.
Very good. Thanks, Mick. Actually, Mick, next question is for you as well, where you're obviously doing this work in Dublin at the moment. As I said, it's a huge piece of work and there's going to be a lot of challenges associated with it. But previously you worked for a long time in London, particularly in Croydon and Tottenham, I know. Are there any learnings or experiences you've had in the UK which are either relevant or very different to your experiences doing this kind of work in Ireland?
I'm sure, yes, there are. People are people, and people's concerns are people's concerns. How we live, like Ireland and the UK, they're not culturally that different. Things are done slightly different, and it took me a while to readjust. But largely, people are people. They kind of want to do the same things in the similar kind of way. Processes are slightly different. I think one thing I do. And I think at a local level in Ireland, I think there's politically, I think there's a lot more feeling of being disenfranchised and removed from real decision making. Whereas I think in the UK, particularly like in a lot of local councils, kind of around the home counties and that, I think there is more power at a local level. So I do think that as a result of that, you can sometimes find that politicians are. They feel like they have to take an anti-position because they're kind of backed into a corner. So maybe that's a difference. That's probably one difference I've noticed is maybe there is a little bit more of a disenfranchised local councillor level with maybe slightly less power than maybe in the UK, and that can have negative impacts.
Okay, interesting. Phil, I have quite a specific question for you in relation to reusing old buildings or living over the shop and similar schemes, where we've had, I think, a few challenges in Ireland here in terms of building regulations and particularly access to fire accessibility and safety. How has Scotland overcome those problems, or is that an issue you still face?
It's still an ongoing issue. We have some relaxation of control, which was asked for by Minister, but in reality, through experience, whenever we set out on the agenda, we had to bring everybody together, all the relevant agencies. So Homes for Scotland, the private sector, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the main social house providers, Association of Local Council House Builders. We brought in the professional sector like RICS, RTPI, the architects, etc. Got everybody into a room and looked at how do we actually tackle this and how do we get it up to a scalable program level. And those were the questions that we were always hit with. We come to the conclusion that the most viable way of doing it was at the scale of a block. If you tried to properties, it's virtually impossible. The scale of the abnormals just is horrendous. And you don't have social housing providers willing to manage highly distributed estates, a flat here, a house there. So it was basically going in using both CPO and CSO as part of a place-based vision to actually take in one go. And we're seeing this in Dumfries and Galloway, and the town of Dumfries, which is the anchor town in the southwest of Scotland, where they're literally zoning the town as blocks, virgin, retrofit and refurb at that scale. So you overcome the economic gap, you overcome the difficulties with carbon retrofit, and also the health and safety and fire, etc. So maybe one bit of fire security infrastructure can benefit in multiple properties. So you can come up with scaled solutions that actually remove some of the cost gap. But you'll never build above a fish and chip shop or a bank or a jewelry shop. You have to remember that. But we done a deep analysis, and we worked out that across the country, 40% of the space above the shop was lying empty, 40%. And roughly 30% of that could be retrieved. And that's not counting empty homes. That is tens of thousands of properties that with a little bit of effort could actually be brought back into productive use. So it's definitely worth doing it. And I'll not lie, the economics behind this are very difficult. Commercial sector, there needs to be subsidy behind it. But my argument to local government leaders and to central government and housing officials is this is a one-off fit. This isn't like the health budget, a recurring budget that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You fix it once, you've fixed it forever. So why not just take that hit and get it done? Because it's taking the long-term patient capital approach. It's taking a different view on it. That long-term, you will bring economic vibrancy, the properties back in use, you've retrieved it, that's it. So it's difficult, but it needs to be done.
Very good, thanks, Phil. Ali, I have a specific question for you as well, which has come through, which is, people are saying the very interesting and valuable presentation, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on how the collaborative town centre health check can work kind of towards provision of housing, specifically within towns?
Okay, so like step 2 is the land use survey, so what we're trying to identify are how many vacant buildings are there and what's the type at the minute, or what was the last use. So, for example, in Tipperary, we found 14 vacant residential buildings actually in the town centre. So we had a meeting this week with a vacant homes officer in Tipperary. So we're trying to sort of get on that pathway of, being able to work at a scale. But again, we really need the town centre first policy there. And also phase 2 is very much about the buildings. So once we've got the data and the baselines in place, then we're hoping to move to phase 2, which is looking at the modelling, right? The sort of building modelling, 3D modelling of our town centre. So just to say as well about ownership. So what we're finding, like I'm thinking of Dundalk here, the ground floor in Dundalk Town Centre, a lot of the retail shops, retail units that are functioning, they're owned by one owner, and then the upper floors are owned by another owner, and then maybe the backlands is owned by another owner. So like it's that rich tapestry that we're trying to get, that pattern of land use and building ownership. And it's quite, as Phil says, there's no point doing it building by building. We need to do it in clusters to get the economies of scale and to also get the economies of repetition. And I mentioned in my slides that, we're moving towards social cost benefit. That's what the European Commission has told me, that webinar that we did in February with the Irish Regions European Office. I mean, it was very clear to them that they want the baselines. They want to know, okay, what's there? What are the social benefits if we actually do intervention in these buildings in the town centres, right? And then that argument has to be put forward, and the town centre first policy really needs to start that narrative and that pivot towards talking about community benefits, right? Whether it's climate change, whether it's reuse of buildings, the utilities, the infrastructure, it all exists in our town centres, and also one of the things that we need to look at is, do we need to knock through on the upper floors? And that's why we need up-to-date heritage information and significance statements of significance, right? Because, some of those buildings we will be able to knock through and have a decent sort of residential unit. Some of the buildings are quite small. Also, what we find with the buildings in Ireland, which is possibly unlike the ones in Scotland, Phil, because we did some research back in 2019, is that the style of our buildings in our town centres, it's not very easy to do to adapt them. And some of the stairs have been taken out and things like that, to do with rates and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge task, as I say, and I mean, we've done an enormous lift. And we really welcome national policy now to support what we're doing in this collaborative programme.
Very good, thank you. My last question is for all three of you, but I'm going to ask you to maybe keep your answers very short, which is unfair because it's a very long question or a very broad question, but we've only got about 2 or 3 minutes left. But I think it's kind of a broader question, which is that obviously within town centres and across the countries, there's a range of reasons why properties are deserted or properties become vacant, and often it is, as Phil said, a kind of a preference for new builds, single builds, then commuting to a retail outlet to do your shopping or whatever, and a kind of the traditional living in the town and buying locally is it's not as strong. When regeneration takes place, so when these vacant properties are, particularly vacant homes, are regenerated and are lived in again, how can we make sure that it's sustainable and the community will want to stay there? So, Phil, maybe if you have any thoughts on that, given that you've a lot of work in this area, and you've mentioned a few examples in your slides earlier. When we do have renovation and vacancies filled in towns, how do you make sure that in 10 years, those populations will want to stay in those towns?
Yeah. Quite simply, it has to be part of a vision. If you go along the lines of town centre housing, people will just turn off. They'll not understand it. They'll just think, oh, it's too difficult. If you could come up with a place vision, which has residential, it has mixed use, it has a purpose, very quickly you can significantly change the character and form of a place. Mixed experience in London, I mean, a long time ago, I was in London, like every Irish person has to do that. And I went back a few years ago to a conference and I couldn't find me. It had been totally transformed. This was Manor Park, East End. You know, we had Canary Wharf and a complete gentrification. There was no Irish people or black people. Everybody was wearing braces and going into the city. You know, so they totally transformed the place. Whether that's good or bad, it's probably bad because it wasn't looking at the indigenous population. But the trick here, I'll take Paisley as a case in point. Paisley's our biggest town. Paisley was a town of wealth. It invented a lot of chemical bleaching textiles, obviously the Paisley pattern. So there's a lot of philanthropy, beautiful buildings, etc. And then its way. Nobody was living in the town centre. It became quite edgy and dark and antisocial. Everybody had moved to nice big housing estates on the edge of town and you all went to work in Glasgow. So the leader of Renfrewshire Council said, this is our main town, we need to fix it. So he came up with a 20-year vision, which incorporated zoning the town, shrinking the retail footprint, bringing it to live. And if you take a look, I showed you some of those pictures on the slides. They looked at the housing need and demand assessment for the region. They brought that down to local housing strategy level. They talked to the people on the ground. They looked at what Paisley was due to become in 20 years' time and started to build that housing product above the frontages, keeping those frontages, which very quickly filled out with restaurants, coffee shops, bars. And all of a sudden, with cute lighting and making the most of the existing civic realm and space, uplighting at night, you actually think you're walking through like a Greenwich Village in New York. It's Paisley, but it really does. So if you bring that vision of a long-term nurture and tell people will want to come to that, you cannot buy a flat in Paisley now. That vision has sold and people are buying into it. You've got the train on your doorstep, you can give up your car, you've got all the amenities beside you. And think of the aging demographic likewise. We don't want them miles to a medical centre, or we don't want the young ones having to drive 20 miles to university. These are things that could be distributed across our existing town and cities. We just need to be more imaginative about how we do it. Yes, it's more difficult, but it's a one-off hit and it's fixed forever. But you need to build a vision around it. You can't just say, here's a load of houses, we hope you stay. It has to be broader than that and more multi-agency, partnership focused.
Great, thank you, Phil. Mick, I might come to you next kind of for the same question about the challenge.
Well, look, I think I wouldn't add much to what Phil has said, and I think what's telling is the way he's described that. I'm actually Googling Paisley right now to find out a bit more about it, but I think that's it. I think he's kind of put it really well, and you know, evidence of I'm now having a look at what Paisley's like, and if I was looking for a home or a place to live, that's how you go about it. So yeah, no, I wouldn't add anything to that.
Well, you wouldn't get an apartment there anymore. Oh, that's fantastic. Ali, would you have anything to add on that?
No, just, I mean, I suppose, Phil, you know, I think Scotland's further ahead, obviously, quite a few years than us, you know, in terms of they've got their data sets, they've got their structures, as it just highlighted, you know, they've got 40 bids, we've only got 4, you know, town centre bids. So, you know, just in terms of like the surveys that we do, I just wanted to, because I see it there in the question as well, just to emphasise that, you know, we work with the business improvement districts, like, for example, in Dundalk and Sligo. We also work with the chambers, and all our surveys, particularly the land use one, is peer reviewed. You know, so like I'm really strict and quite, I suppose, pedantic to make sure that our data is, as my brother would say, bulletproof, you know, that it can be used. And, you know, we are primary data. We create that data. We walk the streets. We talk to the business owners. I mean, that's one of the things that I really believe in, that data is it's citizen data, really. And what we're trying to do is sort of democratize data in this country, geospatial data.
Fantastic. That's very interesting to hear, Ali, because, you know, as one of the issues that I know kind of comes up in relation to vacancy is a difficulty kind of in defining what vacancy is. It's kind of different estimates around the country. You've got the CSO estimates, there's different, have different mapping estimates that could be quite diverse. So I think having kind of quality data and being able to kind of track things over time is such a strength when you're trying to undertake such major policies and address such a major issue. And Phil, obviously you mentioned that, one thing that you do is try and come up with these typologies and have a very data-driven way of evaluating what you're doing and the success of projects. So that wasn't really a question, it was more of a, I suppose there is a kind of an understanding with yourself, Ali and Phil, about the importance of having that data there and being able to kind of track what's happening over time.
You can't do it successfully without real data. And what we're seeing now is, having developed USP as a starting point, that in its own right was enough to actually not just remove anecdote and emotion, but actually challenge fact. So I would have had the leader of a local authority saying, I can't understand why my town is not working. I'll look at my demographic and it seems to be wealthy. Why aren't people, where are these people going? At the press of a button, I could show them that ABCD socioeconomic groups had gone to Glasgow to work in universities, hospitals, council jobs. So what he had in his town centre during the daytime was basically pension income and unemployment benefit. So I said, you need to start thinking more radically about bringing in young families, repopulation of your coastline, making use of your less expansive land, good mix, but selling a lifestyle concept. You've got gateway to the islands, you've got views of the Highlands. You need to use on your connectivity to the city. So having that data inspired a completely new approach from that local government in terms of their regeneration strategy. North Ayrshire Council, they won the National Planning Awards for taking our data model and going across each of their towns and settlements in Aran Island and basically coming up with an economic and housing and regeneration strategy that was totally evidential based. It sometimes surprises people. Alloa, for example, on the face of it, looks to be a very bustling, prosperous market town, but there was no evening economy and there was no competing areas that would take that evening economy away. So people were saying, what's the problem? And again, they would make assumptions. I don't know, there's not the right restaurants or whatever. Basically, Public Health Scotland went in and they identified that it was 18 to 26-year-old males who'd been unemployed periods of time, who just genuinely gathered in the heart of the town and made an environment that was unattractive for people to engage with. So by taking them away and working with those guys, and then realizing that there was a prevention agenda to take a hold of, all of a sudden Alloa now has an evening economy because the barrier was removed through evidence. And that evidence came from an unusual source, which was Public Health Scotland, our new health agency. How often do we bring these different voices into the table? Because we are now looking at well-being. We are looking at a different set of metrics to look at what success is. And success to me is not always about economic value. It's more to do with social and environmental value. And we'll have to think about that as well.
Thank you, Phil. Actually, I think that's a nice kind of message to maybe end this Q&A session on. So first of all, sincerely thank the three of you for coming in, for giving up your time and for sharing your expertise. We have a pile of questions coming in and unfortunately we haven't got to them all. But I think that's just a testament to the interest in the projects you're working on and the clarity of your presentations. So thank you very much for that. And again, thank you to those of you who are sending in questions and have engaged so enthusiastically both today and throughout the rest of the week. This is the final day of the conference, so I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our policy and practice team who pulled the conference together very successfully. So Rosa Malloy, Tara Doyle, Alex Dowdall, Sarah Kennedy and Michael McHale, and especially for Gemma for providing all the technical support. Thank you also to all our speakers, chairs and the Minister for opening. And now I'm going to hand over to Bob Jordan, the CEO of the Housing Agency, who's going to say a few words to close. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Sinead. Hope you can hear me okay. I'd like to thank Ali, Phil and Mick for such a wonderful session today, the conclusion of a big week for the Housing Agency. Obviously, this year's conference very much built around the Housing for All strategy. On Monday, we had a hybrid in-person and online event in Dublin Castle with the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien. We're very grateful to the Minister. The Minister outlined the actions in Housing for All, the multi-annual funding in place to support them. And I think the government's determination to increase supply, improve affordability, and to ensure that no one is left behind by the housing system. For the following 4 days, we moved on to virtual sessions concentrating on a particular pathway in Housing for All each day: home ownership and affordability, social housing, homelessness and social inclusion, increasing new housing supply, and obviously today around vacancy and reusing housing stock. And we hope that for you out there, that the presentations and discussions have really helped you to gain a better understanding and insight into the 213 actions in Housing for All. Obviously, you, the audience, have been key to the success of this conference in terms of your questions and comments. Just to let you know that we had 1,600 individuals take part in the conference this week, an average of 300 per day, hitting a peak of around 500. So that's, you know, that I think shows the level of interest in this government strategy. Listen, you know, like you all, I hope we'll be back with face-to-face events next year. We really hope that that's the place we'll be in, but there is a place for virtual events. And I suppose one of the benefits is that perhaps people who couldn't have joined us in person from Ireland and indeed from across the globe have been able to participate this week. This time next year, we'll be reviewing the progress on Housing for All, having been 12 months into the strategy. Just to say that we in the Housing Agency here are geared up to support you, our stakeholders, in carrying out so many of the actions in the plan. Cost rental, Croí Cónaithe, the changes to Part 5, age-friendly homes, Housing First, bringing vacant properties back into use, and so many others. And I suppose finally, just some thank yous. I want to warmly thank the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, for opening our event and for speaking so comprehensively about the plan. Our chair, Michael Carey, who opened the conference on Monday. Obviously, I'd like to thank all our speakers, panelists, and session chairs for their insights and their expertise. And finally, you know, I'd like to thank, there's a big team in the Housing Agency putting on this event this week without a hitch. Rosalind Malloy, Michael McHale, Sarah Kennedy, Alex Dowdall, Tara Doyle, and Gemma O'Halloran for all our technical expertise. And listen, there are other people in the agency, too many to name here, but just to thank everybody for putting on such a successful conference. And listen, we hope to see you all this time next year. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this year's Housing Conference 2021. We'll finish out the session today. Have a great weekend.